Thank you. Yep. Okay, so you'll see that what I wanted to share with you today chimes very much with Curtis's presentation earlier. So this is about how people make the decision whether or not to consent. And well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge co-authors in this project and our funders. And well, as background, this is very much also an Understanding Society methods study. You probably know the annual interview we implement using a mix of an online questionnaire, face-to-face interviewing, and telephone interviewing. And we collect, since the first wave of Understanding Society, we've been collecting for consents to link to government administrative data, tax records, health, education, all sorts. We've also started collecting consents to link to financial data and of course the social media things you've been hearing about. And now one thing we observe, which Tarek also pointed out, is that when respondents complete our survey and answer this question, this consent question online, they're much less likely to consent than when they're asked in a face-to-face interview. And so that's one thing I noticed about the Twitter data, what Tarek showed us. The consent rates were a lot lower, even face-to-face, but then the gap was a bit smaller between face-to-face and web. So here with the administrative records, we get higher consent rates in the, I think, 70 to 80% face-to-face, but then we have a big drop, and online, the consent rates are about 30 percentage points lower. So that is a big challenge for us. So we were scratching our heads and thinking, well, what can we do to improve consents in the web survey? And so maybe to start, I wanted to just say, so at the time, a few years ago, when we started this project, there was some things that we knew from previous literature on consent to data linkage. So that included that we see quite a large variation in the rates of consents depending on what data we want to link. So people are more reluctant to consent to us linking financial data, so their tax records, benefits data, and they're more willing to give us consent to link education or health data. We see variations between interviewers. We see in studies that have looked at respondent or interviewer characteristics to predict who gives consent, we see that there aren't really any sort of stable characteristics, stable predictors, and that's the case so between different surveys, but even within the same surveys over time. So the observed characteristics of interviewers and respondents don't really explain who consents and who doesn't. And then there's also a series of experiments in this literature that have tested different ways of wording the question. So whether it might help to wait a few waves before you ask for consent rather than asking in the first wave, emphasizing the benefit to the respondent or to the survey, different ways of framing the request. And this is quite surprising because quite a lot of these experiments have had null findings. So they've the researchers haven't managed to shift consent rates very much. So there's a lot of variation, but we don't really understand why there's this variation in consent rates. And then there are also some really striking findings in the previous literature. So as Curtis also said in relation to the Twitter consent, also with consent to administrative linkage, there are a couple of studies that have examined how well people have understood the request to link the data and found that many respondents don't really understand what we're asking. Another peculiar finding is that in longitudinal studies, if you take those respondents who say, no, I don't want you to link my data, and then a year or two later, when we interview them again, we ask them the same question again, then half of those initial non-consenters, the next time will say, yes, you can link my data. So that suggests this is not a fixed decision, it can be influenced, but we don't yet know, we don't understand by what, how we can influence this. Another curious finding is that in some studies, respondents are asked for consent to multiple things, so to link their health data, their education data, their tax data, for example. And so there are some authors that have modeled these consents jointly, so predicting the probability of consents across these consents. and then testing whether the unobserved characteristics across these models are correlated. And they found that that is the case. So that suggests that there are unobserved characteristics that are correlated with consenting or not consenting. So it suggests that people have a latent willingness to consent or not consent. So if they're willing to consent to one thing, they're also likely to consent to something else. Now, the curious thing is that this latent willingness to consent doesn't seem to be stable over time. So there's one paper that's done the same kind of analysis, but using data from a longitudinal study that collected different consents at different points in time. So unlike the previous studies that all collected the consents in the same interview, these are collected at different points in time, but of the same people. And here, if you do the same kind of analysis, you find that there is no longer such a latent willingness to consent. So that disappears. So that suggests that really it's situational factors that are important. So within one survey interview, there are factors that influence whether people are likely to consent. And if they're likely to consent to one thing, they're likely to consent to other things as well. But that's not a stable trait, if you like. So we were really puzzled by the previous literature and weren't sure really how we could improve the situation, and especially increasing consent among our web respondents. So we thought we really need to first understand how respondents make this decision whether or not to consent. So what's going on in their heads? So what we did, we started with some qualitative in-depth interviews that Kantar carried out for us. And similar to Curtis's study, here we were working with our own sample members from the innovation panel, and we selected purposely people who had consented and who had not consented, who'd been asked online and in face-to-face interviews, so we had a mix. But they were all people who knew what we were talking about. They'd all taken part in our survey and they'd experienced the consent questions. So here the focus of these interviews was to try and examine what determines whether respondents consent. So what factors play a role, and the themes that the Kantar interviewers were looking at were rational factors, subconscious, social, environmental, different things. Okay, we then, based on that conceptual framework and other things that I'll tell you about in a minute, these qualitative interviews, we developed a conceptual framework just to help us try and clarify how we think people are making this decision to consent or not. And from that, we then derived some hypotheses that we tested experimentally. And some of that was done in the innovation panel that's implemented by Kantar and Natsen. And then we did some additional experimentation on the Populous Live online access panel. And in fact, Curtis led that implementation for us. We've done most recently some more experiments on the COVID-19 study, but I'm not going to talk about those today. So this conceptual framework, so how do people make the decision whether to consent? So like I said, we started with the results from these qualitative interviews that already gave us a lot of insights into how people make the decision and what kind of factors influence their decision. And we then sort of tried to marry that up with the cognitive model of the survey response process. So that sounds rather grand, but this cognitive model really is just a simple conceptualization about what people have to do to answer our survey questions. So they have to understand the question, they have to retrieve relevant information from memory, they have to form a judgment, and then they have to decide what they're actually going to say, given what answer options we've given them, for example. Okay, so we were sort of trying to bring the two together because, of course, the consent question is a survey question. So how did what we learned from the qualitative interviews, how did that relate to this cognitive response process? And we already saw in the qualitative interviews some evidence that not everybody is doing this in an optimal way, sort of, considering all costs and benefits rationally, but some people are shortcutting this process. And Curtis referred to that as well when you talked about heuristic decision making. So we also then drew on the survey methods literature, previous analysis and experiments, of course. And then also, because again, this is about decision making, it's about effortful or sort of more superficial heuristic processing. So we also drew on literature on rational versus heuristic decision making. So here, there's the idea, or system 1 and system 2 processing are the terms that are used here, that when human beings make decisions, we do this in different ways. The bulk of decisions we make in a very rapid subconscious way. So this is the system 1 decisions. But then we can also engage in more effortful, deliberate processing that can override the quick fire decisions. And then also in psychology, there's relevant literature on how people make real life decisions. And that's shown that when people are faced with a decision, for example, about what university course to choose or which school to send their kids to, there's a whole list of criteria, information that they could base their decision on. And actually what they do is they select a subset of all these criteria and base their decision just on this subset of information. And well, you'll see, so I've added references at the end of the slides if you're interested in reading up on any of these. Okay, so here's how we're now thinking about how respondents decide whether to consent. So we're looking at, in terms of outcomes, did they consent, yes or no, but also how well did they understand this request, and also how confident are they in their decision. So, if they're not fully understanding, are they comfortable with their decision? Okay. Then, of course, there's a number of background characteristics of the respondents themselves. So their prior experiences and knowledge, their cognitive capacity, their attitudes, their previous data sharing behaviors, for example, those will have an effect on whether they consent or not, how well they understand. The organizations involved, so I've already said that people are more reluctant to share financial data, depending on the data holder. Is that an organization they trust? Seems people don't trust the DWP very much. The survey, do they trust the survey? And then, of course, the survey design. So the context and the format of the consent question and things like the mode that I've mentioned. So we think these will have some direct effect on these outcomes, but we think also, this is what we're really interested in, that these background effects, characteristics will have some effect on how people make the decision. And here's this idea that really there's sort of maybe a continuum of decision processes. Some are more reflective, so that's when respondents are really taking in a lot of the information and sort of making a rational decision, or less reflective, where they're making the decision much more quickly just based on a subset of the information. Now, we don't observe this decision process, obviously, but we try to measure that, and I'll show you how in a minute. And then, of course, we also look at some additional markers and indicators that we think will be correlated with how people make the decision. So how quickly are they making this decision? Are they reading additional information? And we can also ask them how much effort they made. So we expect that if we're measuring this decision process in a valid way, we should see differences in these markers of effort between respondents. So that's the general framework. Then based on that, the hypotheses that I want to tell you about here today. So on how we think respondents decide whether to consent. So the context, people are making this consent decision in a very short time frame. So it's just a short time within the survey interview, and they necessarily have incomplete information. So we give them information about what we want to do with the data, what data is involved, how the linkage is going to happen. But of course, we don't know, we can't tell them, what's the probability of, a data leak, or what would happen even if, if the data were leaked. So they don't have full information on everything that could happen if they consent to this. So based on, again, the previous literature, the various strands that I told you about, we're assuming that respondents use heuristic decision processes. So that means simply that we expect that respondents are going to choose some subset of information based on which they're going to make the decision. And actually that corresponds to what Curtis mentioned as well, people basing their decision on trust or other things. And then we think that if they're using a more reflective process or a less reflective process, that should mean that they're using more or less information to base their decision on, and they're possibly also using different kinds of information. Then we think there might be differences between individuals and also the contexts they're in. in which process they use, whether they use a more or less reflective process. And then importantly, we think that there will be a link, a correlation between what process they use and what they then actually say. So whether or not they consent and how well they've understood the request. Okay, so here's how we've tested these things. So here we're working with a single consent question that is about consent to link the respondent's tax records held by HMRC. And the question we started with was an actual survey question that had previously been used in Understanding Society. And it's a lot of text, so I've not put everything up here that explains what we want to do and why. And then the actual question at the end is, do you give permission for us to pass your name, address, sex, and date of birth to HMRC for this purpose? So those are the variables, the identifiers that are going to be used to link the data. Yes or no. And the questionnaires around this consent question included some additional background questions where we asked about people's attitudes and behaviors, for example, and then a series of follow-up questions about how they made this consent decision that I'll tell you about in a minute. And then we replicated this consent question and the follow-up questions on several surveys. So one is the Understanding Society Innovation Panel, and then also the Populous Live panel that I've mentioned before. So here in this paper on how people make the decision, we're treating those as replications, if you like. So we have the same setup and we're checking whether the results that we get, whether they're consistent across the different samples. So this little table here just gives you an idea of the sample sizes that we're working with. In the Access panel, we had one sample that we interviewed twice with a 1-year interval, and then a second sample as well. Okay, so the first hypothesis was that respondents predominantly use heuristic decision processes. So how did we test that? We asked respondents this consent question, and then we asked, how did you decide whether to say yes or no in response to the question about data linkage? And then we gave them several options and they could select all that applied to them. I thought about what would happen if I said yes or no, and we've labeled that a consequentialist decision. Instinct or gut feeling. I said what I usually say when I'm asked for information that's very personal. So habit, or I thought about how much I trust the organizations involved, or something else. And I should say, we didn't just pick these response options out of thin air. These were all themes that came up in the qualitative interviews about what factors influence whether or not people consent. And here, so what we see is, this is just from one of the samples, but the patterns are similar across all the samples. So 38% of respondents said they based their decision on thinking about the consequences or thinking about how much they trust the organizations, or both. So either one of those or both. And then a similar proportion, 37%, said they based their decision on gut feeling or habit, or both. And then 25% said something else, or it was a combination of one of the first two and one of the second two. Okay, so the takeaway here is that really only just over a third of respondents made a reflective decision, so where they thought about the consequences or they thought about the trust. All other respondents said that they based their decision on gut feeling or on habit or maybe something else. So that's quite striking. So most people are not making, a fully thought through rational decision, but they're making gut feeling or habit or other decisions. Now, you might wonder how good our question is that we came up with to measure this decision process. So we spent a bit of time analyzing that to check, is this a valid measure? Are we really measuring differences between people? And so here what I'm going to show you is some differences between respondents who reported a less reflective decision, so based on habit or gut feeling, and those who've reported a more reflective decision based on thinking about consequences or trust. And we see across a number of different indicators, we see clear differences between these two groups of respondents. So first of all, the speed with which they answered the question. So the less reflective decision makers, This is based on the samples that completed the survey online, so we can use the paradata to look at response times. So the less reflective decision makers, they only took up to half a minute to answer this question, so very quick. The more reflective decision makers, still quite quick, but they took between half a minute and not quite 1.5 minutes. So there's a clear difference in terms of how long they spent making this decision that we can see in the data. We can also see, so we collected paradata on whether or not they clicked on links in the question. So the consent question included a link to a leaflet, an information leaflet, and a link to a diagram that visually explained the linkage. So we can see how many people clicked on those links. And here we also see clear differences. The more reflective decision makers were much more likely to actually click on those links than the less reflective decision makers. And then we also asked people to self-report. How much effort did you make in answering this question? And we also see differences between these two groups. So we think that this self-reported decision process does measure real differences between respondents in how they make the decision. So the second hypothesis was that if people are using reflective or less reflective decision making, then they're drawing on different amounts of information and also different kinds of information. So how did we test that? One of the follow-up questions after the consent was, when you were deciding whether or not to allow your data to be linked, how much of a role did each of the following aspects play in your decision? And so this was a number of 14 different aspects. And for each, the respondent had to rate this as having played no role, 1 or 5 played a very big role. And here we also see some quite clear differences. So this is just comparing those who based their decision on thinking about the consequences versus gut or habit. And here we see that those who based their decision on thinking about the consequences, they were more likely to say they considered what information the government has about them, how much they trust the organization, or the benefits to society. So that's just to say they considered different types of information. And also, if we just simply count how many of these 14 did they select, then the consequence-based decision makers, they also reported a larger number of aspects. So then the third hypothesis was that there are differences between individuals and contexts in which decision process people are using. And so first of all, well, on the left-hand side here, this is based on models where we modeled the probability that people made the decision based on thinking through the consequences. And here we see that that's much more likely for people who had a degree compared to those with the lowest education. They were more likely to say they based their decision based on thinking about the consequences. Similarly, if we model the probability that they based their decision on thinking about how much they trust the organizations involved, there's a large age difference here. The older age group are much more likely to say they based their decision on trust. And then we also looked at variations in how we asked the question. We had a manipulation of where we asked, early or late in the questionnaire. We varied the reading difficulty. We had a trust priming experiment, and those had no effect on which decision process people used. In a way, that's a shame. So we haven't managed to influence how people make the decision with these design experiments. Okay. So what's next? Oh, and then also over time. So the sample that were interviewed twice, so after 12 months. So when we asked them the same question, the same follow-up questions again, and we see that among those who said they based their decision on considering the consequences or trust, 56% of those said the same a year later, and similarly 54% of those who said they based their decision on habit or gut feeling said the same a year later. So there is some churning over time. So the decision process people use in one wave isn't sort of a stable characteristic. It's not a decision-making trait that they'll then take with them and use again in the next survey. So this is to say we conclude that we think there's some evidence of differences between people and context in the decision process that they use. And then this is the last one here, that different processes are associated with differences in consent propensities and understanding. So this graph shows the consent rates by decision process, and we see really large differences. So respondents who said they based their decision on considering the consequences or how much they trust the organizations involved, we see 80 to 90% consent rates. And at the other end, those who make a habit-based decision, only 20% consent. So large differences in consent rates by decision process. And then similarly, understanding. So we had two ways of measuring how well respondents understood the request. So first, we asked a number of objective test questions. So these were true-false knowledge questions about the data linkage. And then we simply count how many did the respondent get right. And we also ask subjectively, how well do you think you understand what would happen with your data if you allow us to link? And on both of these, we see clear differences, that those who make a decision based on considering the consequences or trust, so the more reflective decision makers, have better understanding of the consent request. And here the only thing is to say, though, is that we don't think this is necessarily a causal association. So we see that this association between how they make the decision and the outcome of that decision, but there are also the direct effects of the background characteristics. And so we don't think this is necessarily a causal effect. Okay, so then to wrap up, we've seen that respondents vary in how they make consent decisions. So some people use more reflective processes, others less reflective, more rapid, instinctive processes, so based on gut feeling or habit. These processes vary in the type and the amount of information that the decision is based on, and which process a respondent uses depends to some extent on their own characteristics, but also varies over time. So there seem to be contextual influences that we don't fully understand yet. And then implications. So it's clear the majority do not use a fully reflective process. So they're unlikely to read additional information materials. They base their decisions on only a small range of information. They make their decision very quickly. So, and I think this was Curtis's conclusion as well. So simply providing more information about the linkage does not increase informed consent. And then, those who make more reflective decisions, so they're more likely to consent and have better understanding of the request, but we don't think this is necessarily causal. So here we don't know, is it possible to shift respondents so that they make a more reflective decision based on thinking through the consequences or based on trust? And would that increase informed consent? We don't know. Yeah, that's it. Those are the references. And thank you for listening.